The carriage wheels stopped rolling, and Duke Nathaniel Hale stepped down with a folded paper gripped tightly in his hand. His jaw was set, his eyes cold, and his mind was made up. Today, the marriage that had trapped him for 3 long years would finally end. He walked toward the old stone house at the edge of Ashcombe Estate, the same house he had sent his wife to live in after their separation, and he did not slow his pace even as the wind cut sharp against his coat. He did not knock softly. He struck the door twice, hard, the way a man strikes something he wants gone quickly. A young maid opened it, her face pale the moment she recognized him. She stammered a greeting and stepped aside without being asked. Nathaniel walked past her without a word, his boots echoing against the wooden floor of a house he had visited perhaps 3 times in the entire span of his marriage. He found the sitting room empty, and impatience flared in his chest. He had ridden 2 hours from the city, past fields turning gold with the last days of summer, only to be kept waiting in an empty room. He turned toward the staircase, ready to call out, when a voice stopped him cold. "You did not send word that you were coming." Nathaniel turned, and the paper in his hand nearly slipped from his fingers. Alara Winters stood in the doorway, one hand resting against the frame, the other resting low against her stomach, which curved outward in a way that made his breath catch in his throat. She wore a simple gray dress, her chestnut hair pulled back loosely, and her eyes, once soft whenever they looked at him, now held nothing but quiet steel. For the first time in his adult life, Nathaniel Hale had no words. He stared at her, at the unmistakable shape beneath her dress, and something inside him twisted violently, like a rope pulled too tight and then released all at once. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He closed it again. His eyes moved from her face to her stomach and back to her face, searching for some explanation, some trick of fabric or shadow that would undo what he was seeing. There was none. "You came to finish it," Alara said quietly, nodding toward the paper crushed in his fist. "Then finish it. I will not stop you." Still, he said nothing. His mind raced through weeks and months, counting backward, trying to make sense of a timeline that refused to cooperate with the story he had told himself about their marriage. They had not shared a home in over 6 months. Before that, they had barely shared a conversation, and yet here she stood, carrying a child that could only be explained one way, and the weight of that single truth pressed down on him like a collapsing ceiling. "How?" he finally managed, his voice rough. "How long?" "Does it matter to you now?" Alara asked. There was no anger in her tone, only exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying something heavy and alone for a long time. "You are here for the papers. I signed my portion already. There is a pen on the table if you wish to add yours." She turned to walk away, and it was that motion, her calm willingness to let him go without a single plea, that finally broke through the fog in his mind. "Wait!" The word came out sharper than he intended, almost desperate. Alara paused but did not turn around. "Alara, look at me." Slowly, she faced him again, her chin lifted, refusing to let him see how much effort it took to remain steady. "Is it mine?" he asked. The question left his mouth before he could soften it, and he watched her flinch as though he had struck her. "You have every right to doubt me," she said, her voice trembling now, despite her effort to hold it firm. "You made it very clear, many times, that you doubted everything about me. So doubt this too, if you must. That is not an answer." "It is the only answer you deserve right now," she said. And this time, she did turn and walk away, leaving him standing alone in the hallway, with the divorce papers still crumpled in his fist, and a question burning through his chest, that he suddenly, desperately, needed answered. He followed her. He found her in the small garden behind the house, sitting on a wooden bench beneath an old oak tree, her hands folded over her stomach protectively, as though shielding the child from him even now. He approached slower this time, his earlier fury replaced with something far more uncertain. "I did not come here to fight with you," he said, lowering himself onto the far end of the bench, careful to leave space between them. "I came because our solicitors said the matter needed to be finished in person. I did not know. Would it have changed anything if you had known?" Alara asked, staring straight ahead at the fading roses along the garden wall. "Would you have come sooner? Would you have written even once in 6 months?" Nathaniel had no answer for that either. The truth was that he had not thought of her in months, not truly. He had thought of the arrangement, the paperwork, the inconvenience of a marriage gone cold. He had not thought of Alara Winters as a person sitting alone in a house at the edge of his estate, carrying whatever burden she carried, without a single word of comfort from him. Shame, unfamiliar and unwelcome, crept up his neck. "I was wrong to stay away," he said finally, the words feeling strange in his mouth. He was not a man who apologized easily, and he could see from the way her shoulders tensed that she did not entirely believe him. "You were wrong about a great many things," Alara said softly, "but that does not matter anymore. What matters is that you have your papers, and I have my answer. You may sign and go." "I am not signing anything until I understand what is happening here," Nathaniel said, and for once, there was no command in his voice, only genuine confusion, and something that felt dangerously close to fear. "Alara, please. Is the child mine?" She finally turned to look at him, and in her eyes, he saw something that made his chest ache in a way he did not recognize. A mixture of hurt and hope, so tangled together that he could not tell where one ended and the other began. "Yes," she said simply. "The child is yours. There has never been anyone else, Nathaniel. Not before you, not after you, and certainly not while you were still my husband, no matter how little that title ever meant to either of us." The words hit him harder than he expected. He sat in silence, staring at the space between them on the bench, trying to reconcile the man he had been with the reality now sitting beside him. He thought of the night, months ago, before their formal separation, when a fragile peace had briefly settled between them. A single night he had convinced himself meant nothing in the light of morning. He had walked away from it without a second thought, burying it beneath the weight of old grief and colder habits. He had been wrong to think it meant nothing. "Why did you not tell me?" he asked quietly. "I tried, once," Alara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You were leaving for the city that morning. I stood at the door, and I opened my mouth to speak, and you told me you had no time for conversations that would only complicate an already complicated situation. Do you remember that?" He did remember. He remembered the impatience in his own voice, the way he had brushed past her without truly looking at her face, eager to escape a house that had never felt like home to him. Guilt settled into his stomach like a stone. "I am sorry," he said, and this time the words came easier, though they still felt insufficient against the size of what he was apologizing for. Alara did not respond immediately. She simply looked at him, studying his face, as though trying to determine whether the man in front of her had truly changed, or whether this was simply another performance, another convenient reaction to an inconvenient truth. "What happens now?" she finally asked. "Is entirely your decision, Nathaniel. I have built a life here without you. I did not do it easily, but I did it. I do not need your permission to raise this child, and I certainly do not need your pity." "I am not offering pity," he said, and for the first time since arriving, his voice carried genuine conviction rather than confusion or command. "I am offering to stay, if you will allow it." Alara let out a small, humorless laugh. "You arrived here an hour ago to end our marriage. Now you wish to stay?" "An hour ago, I did not know," he said. "Now I do. And that changes everything?" "It changes what I am willing to fight for," Nathaniel said, and the honesty in his own words surprised even him. Alara studied him for a long moment, her hand still resting protectively over her stomach, her expression unreadable. The wind rustled through the oak tree above them, scattering a few early autumn leaves across the garden path. Somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied, and the ordinary sounds of the estate continued, as though the entire world had not just shifted beneath both of their feet. "You cannot simply decide to care, because circumstances have changed," she finally said. "That is not how trust works, Nathaniel. That is not how any of this works." "I know," he admitted, "but I am asking for the chance to try, regardless." She did not answer him directly. Instead, she rose slowly from the bench, one hand pressed briefly against her lower back, and looked down at him, with an expression that held equal parts exhaustion and quiet resolve. "The papers are still on the table inside," she said. "I will not force you to make a decision today that you might regret tomorrow. Think carefully, Nathaniel. A child is not a reason to stay in a marriage. It is a reason to be careful about what you promise." She walked back toward the house, leaving him alone beneath the oak tree with the crumpled papers still resting uselessly in his coat pocket. He sat there for a long while, staring at nothing, replaying every cold word he had ever spoken to her, every opportunity he had wasted, Every moment he had chosen distance over understanding. By the time the sun began sinking behind the hills, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and violet, Nathaniel Hale had made his decision. He would not sign the papers. Not today, not tomorrow. Not until he had earned back even a fraction of the trust he had so carelessly discarded. He rose from the bench and walked back toward the house, unaware that far beyond the estate walls, in the city he had just left behind, a man named Charles Pemberton was already hearing whispers of the Duke's failed marriage, and already beginning to calculate exactly how he might use that failure to his own advantage. The game, though Nathaniel did not yet know it, had only just begun. Nathaniel did not return to the city that night. Instead, he sent word to his household staff that his business at Ashcombe Estate would take longer than expected, and he asked the housekeeper, a stern but kind woman named Margaret, to prepare the guest room at the far end of the hall. Alara said nothing when she learned of his decision, though the tightness in her shoulders as she passed him in the corridor told him clearly enough that his presence was not entirely welcome. He did not push her. He had learned, in the space of a single afternoon, that pushing had never worked with Alara, and perhaps that had been his mistake from the very beginning. The following morning, he woke before dawn, unable to sleep for more than a few restless hours. He found himself standing at the window of the guest room, watching the mist settle over the fields, and thinking of all the years he had wasted treating his marriage as an obligation rather than a partnership. He thought of his father, who had arranged the match to settle a debt between their two families, and of the cold ceremony that had bound him to a woman he barely knew. He thought of his own grief, still raw at the time, over the loss of his younger brother, and how he had buried himself so deeply in that grief that he had no room left for anyone else, least of all a quiet young woman who had asked for nothing more than his attention. He dressed and went downstairs, expecting to find the house still asleep. Instead, he found Alara already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea in her hands, dark circles beneath her eyes suggesting she had slept even less than he had. "You are up early," he said, hovering awkwardly in the doorway. "I am always up early these days," Alara replied without looking at him. The child does not seem to care much for rest. He hesitated, then stepped into the kitchen and sat across from her, unsure of what to say next. The silence between them stretched long and uncomfortable, filled with everything neither of them knew how to voice. "How far along are you?" he finally asked. 7 months, Alara said. "The physician says everything is progressing as it should." 7 months. Nathaniel did the calculation again in his head, and the number aligned perfectly with the night he had spent trying so hard to forget. A wave of something he could not name washed over him, part guilt, part disbelief, part a strange and unfamiliar tenderness he had never associated with fatherhood before. "I would like to meet with your physician," he said, "if that would be acceptable to you." Alara finally looked up at him, surprise flickering across her face, before she masked it with her usual composure. "Why?" "Because I want to understand what is happening," he said honestly. "Because I have missed 7 months of something I did not know existed, and I do not intend to miss any more of it, if you will allow me to stay involved." "You say that now," Alara said quietly, setting down her cup. "But forgive me if I do not trust words alone anymore, Nathaniel. Words have never been in short supply between us. It is actions that have always been missing." "Then let me show you with actions," he said, "starting today." She studied him for a long moment, her expression guarded but no longer entirely closed off. Finally she nodded, a small, cautious gesture that felt to him like the first real victory he had earned in years. "Dr. Bennett visits every 3rd day," she said. "He is due this afternoon, as it happens. You may join us, if you truly wish to." "I do." The afternoon arrived slower than Nathaniel would have liked, filled with tense, careful conversation, as he and Alara attempted to navigate the strange new territory of speaking honestly with one another. He learned, in fragments, how she had spent her months alone at Ashcombe, how she had grown close with Margaret and the small household staff, how she had taken up gardening to fill the long, quiet days, and how she had cried, more than once, wondering whether she would raise the child entirely alone. Each detail struck him like a small blow, a reminder of exactly how absent he had been. When Dr. Bennett finally arrived, a stout, gray-haired man with kind eyes and a brisk manner, he seemed genuinely surprised to find the Duke present. "Your Grace," he said, offering a respectful bow. I confess, I did not expect to see you here today. Circumstances have changed, Nathaniel said simply, and Dr. Bennett, wisely, did not press further. The examination was brief, conducted in a small private room while Nathaniel waited outside, pacing the length of the corridor with more nervous energy than he had felt in years. When Dr. Bennett finally emerged, he offered a reassuring smile. Both mother and child are in excellent health, he said. The child is strong, and if all continues as it has, you may expect the arrival within the next 2 months. 2 months. The number settled into Nathaniel's chest with startling weight. 2 months to prove himself. 2 months to become the kind of man deserving of the trust Elara had every reason to withhold. Thank you, doctor, he said, and meant it more sincerely than he had meant anything in a very long time. After the doctor departed, Nathaniel found Elara resting in the sitting room, her hand absently tracing circles over her stomach. He approached slowly and, for the first time since his arrival, allowed himself to truly look at her, not as an obligation or a complication, but as the mother of his child, a woman who had endured 7 months of uncertainty, with a strength he was only now beginning to understand. May I? He asked quietly, gesturing toward the space beside her on the settee. She hesitated, then nodded. He sat carefully, leaving a respectful distance between them, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, hesitantly, almost as though testing whether he would flinch away, Elara took his hand and placed it gently against her stomach. Nathaniel froze. A moment later, he felt it. A small, unmistakable movement beneath his palm, and something inside his chest cracked open entirely. He had faced difficult negotiations, managed vast estates, and carried the weight of his family's legacy since he was a young man. But nothing had ever affected him quite like that single, quiet movement beneath his hand. That is your son, Elara said softly, watching his face carefully. Or perhaps your daughter, Dr. Bennett would not say for certain. Nathaniel could not speak. His eyes, to his own great surprise, felt suspiciously warm, and he blinked rapidly, unwilling to let Elara see just how deeply this moment had shaken him. I have missed so much, he finally managed, his voice rough. You have, Elara agreed, no cruelty in her tone, only simple honesty. But you are here now. What you do with the time remaining is what will matter. He nodded, still unable to remove his hand from her stomach, still unable to look away from her face. In that quiet moment, something shifted permanently between them. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the first fragile seed of it. Neither of them noticed the letter that arrived at the estate gate later that evening, addressed to Nathaniel in a hand he would recognize instantly, bearing the seal of a family he had spent years trying to keep at a careful distance. Charles Pemberton had written, expressing polite condolences over the rumored end of the Duke's marriage, and offering, in carefully veiled language, his continued friendship and support during what he called a difficult transition. Margaret set the letter on the hall table, unaware of how quickly the calm settling over the estate would soon be tested, and how little time Nathaniel truly had to prove himself before old threats began circling once more. The letter sat unopened on the hall table for 2 full days before Nathaniel finally noticed it, his attention consumed almost entirely by the fragile new rhythm he was building with Elara. He had begun rising early each morning to walk with her through the garden, careful to match his pace to hers, listening as she pointed out which roses had survived the early frost and which had not. He had taken to reading in the sitting room each evening, rather than retreating to his study, simply so he could remain near her, even if their conversations were still stilted and careful. It was Margaret who finally placed the letter directly into his hands, her expression carefully neutral in the way only a long-time servant could manage. This arrived 2 days past, Your Grace. I did not wish to disturb you sooner. Nathaniel recognized the seal immediately, and something cold settled in his stomach. Charles Pemberton, a distant cousin on his mother's side, and a man who had spent the better part of a decade positioning himself as the next best claim to influence within the Hale family, should Nathaniel's own line ever falter. They had never been close, despite Charles's persistent efforts to suggest otherwise, and Nathaniel had long since learned to treat any correspondence from him with suspicion. He broke the seal and read the letter twice, his frown deepening with each pass. The words themselves were polite, even warm, expressing sympathy over what Charles referred to as the unfortunate dissolution of the Hale marriage, and offering his services in managing certain estate matters during what he delicately called a period of personal difficulty. But beneath the polished language, Nathaniel recognized the unmistakable scent of opportunity being sniffed out, the same way a fox circles a henhouse long before making its move. Charles believed the divorce was already finalized. Word of Nathaniel's journey to Ashcombe had clearly reached the city faster than Nathaniel himself had anticipated, twisted along the way into a rumor of a marriage already ended. Nathaniel folded the letter and tucked it into his coat, saying nothing of it to Alara for the remainder of the day. He did not wish to burden her with old family politics while she carried enough weight already, both literal and otherwise. But that night, long after the household had gone quiet, he sat alone in his study, staring at the letter, turning over the implications in his mind. If Charles believed the marriage was ending, he would waste no time in acting on that belief. Nathaniel knew him well enough to understand that Charles rarely moved without calculation, and an opportunity as significant as a fractured ducal marriage, with an unborn heir whose legitimacy could easily be questioned by anyone willing to spread the right rumors, was not something Charles would simply let pass by. He needed to act quickly and carefully. The following morning, Nathaniel sent a formal notice to his solicitor in the city, instructing him to disregard the divorce proceedings entirely, and to prepare, instead, documents formally and publicly reaffirming his marriage to Alara Winters. He also sent a brief, deliberately vague reply to Charles, thanking him for his concern, but assuring him that all matters regarding the Hale family were well in hand. It was not enough, he knew, to simply deny the rumors. Words alone would do little against a man like Charles, who had built his entire strategy on manipulating perception. Nathaniel needed something more substantial, something undeniable. He found Alara in the garden that afternoon, seated on the same bench beneath the oak tree where they had first spoken honestly with one another. She looked up as he approached, her expression questioning at the unusual seriousness on his face. "I need to speak with you about something important," he said, sitting beside her without waiting for invitation this time, a small shift in their dynamic that Alara noticed but did not comment on. He explained the letter, the rumors already circulating through the city, and Charles's long history of positioning himself for advantage whenever the Hale family showed any sign of weakness. Alara listened quietly, her hand resting protectively over her stomach, her expression growing more guarded with each detail. "And what does this mean for us?" she finally asked. "For the child? It means people may try to question the legitimacy of our marriage, and by extension, the legitimacy of our child's claim to the Hale name," Nathaniel said grimly. "Charles has waited years for an opportunity like this. He will not simply let it pass." Alara's jaw tightened, a flash of protective fury crossing her features that Nathaniel had not seen from her before. "No one will question my child's place in this world," she said firmly. "Not while I have breath in my body to defend it." "Nor while I do," Nathaniel said, and the conviction in his voice surprised even himself. "But we must be strategic. I intend to hold a formal gathering, here at Ashcombe, inviting members of both our families, along with several prominent figures from the city. I will announce, publicly and unmistakably, our reconciliation and the impending arrival of our child. It will leave no room for Charles or anyone else to spread doubt." Alara considered this carefully, her fingers absently smoothing the fabric of her dress. "A public gathering? So soon? I am 7 months along, Nathaniel. I will hardly be able to hide the truth of my condition, nor do I wish to." "You will not need to hide anything," Nathaniel said. "In fact, I want the opposite. I want everyone to see clearly that this child is loved, expected, and protected, so that no rumor Charles spreads will find fertile ground." For a long moment, Alara said nothing, studying him with an expression that mixed calculation with something softer, something that looked almost like the beginning of trust rediscovered. "You have changed," she finally said quietly. "In just a matter of days." "I have had a great deal to reconsider," Nathaniel admitted, "and I intend to keep reconsidering, for as long as it takes to earn back what I so carelessly threw away." She reached out, hesitantly, and placed her hand over his. It was a small gesture, but one that carried enormous weight given everything that had passed between them. "Then let us plan this gathering carefully," she said. "I will not have our child's arrival overshadowed by scheming relatives and idle gossip." The days that followed passed in a flurry of careful preparation. Invitations were drafted and sent to family members on both sides, along with select figures from the city whose opinions carried weight in matters of social standing. Margaret and the household staff threw themselves into preparing the estate, airing out the grand hall that had not seen use since Nathaniel and Ilara's original wedding celebration, polishing silver that had gathered dust during the long months of separation. Nathaniel found himself, for the first time in years, genuinely invested in the details of his own household. He consulted with Ilara on every decision, from the arrangement of flowers to the selection of music, not out of obligation, but because he had come to value her judgment, and more than that, had come to enjoy the simple act of working alongside her toward a shared purpose. Their evenings, once filled with awkward silence, gradually transformed into something warmer. Nathaniel began sharing stories of his childhood, of his younger brother whose loss had shaped so much of his coldness in the years that followed, and Ilara listened with a patience and understanding that slowly began dismantling the walls he had built around himself. In turn, she shared her own history. The years spent in a modest household before her family's fortunes had aligned unexpectedly with the Hale name. The loneliness of arriving in a grand estate as a young bride with no real friends or allies, and the quiet grief of watching a marriage she had once hoped might grow into something real, instead calcify into cold formality. "I did try, in the beginning," she admitted one evening, as they sat together in the sitting room, a fire crackling softly in the hearth. "I used to wait for you each evening, hoping you might wish to speak with me about something other than estate matters. Eventually, I stopped waiting." "I am sorry I gave you reason to stop," Nathaniel said quietly. "I was so consumed by my own grief that I failed to see the person right in front of me, someone who deserved far better than what I offered. We were both young, and neither of us truly chose this marriage for ourselves," Ilara said, though her tone held no bitterness, only reflection. "Perhaps that made it easier to treat it as something separate from our real lives, rather than as something we might build together." "That is no longer how I intend to treat it," Nathaniel said firmly. "This child changes everything, Ilara. Not because a child is a reason to force a marriage to work, but because facing the possibility of losing both of you has shown me exactly what I stand to lose if I continue making the same mistakes." Ilara studied him for a long moment, firelight flickering across her face, before offering him the first genuine smile he had seen from her since his arrival. "Then let us not make the same mistakes," she said softly. "Let us try, truly try, to build something worth having." It was in this fragile, hopeful atmosphere that the day of the gathering finally arrived. Carriages began arriving at Ashcombe from mid-morning onward, filled with relatives, acquaintances, and the sort of prominent city figures whose presence would carry weight in silencing any rumors Charles might attempt to spread. Nathaniel greeted each guest personally, Ilara at his side, her hand resting comfortably in the crook of his arm, her condition visible and undeniable to every single person who passed through the grand hall's doors. He watched carefully as certain faces registered surprise, quickly followed by calculation, as the guests absorbed the reality before them. A duke standing proudly beside his very pregnant wife, offering no hint of the divorce rumors that had spread so quickly through the city just days before. Then, near the back of the arriving carriages, Nathaniel spotted a familiar figure stepping down, dressed impeccably in dark green, an expression of polite curiosity carefully arranged across his features. Charles Pemberton had arrived, and Nathaniel felt Ilara's grip tighten slightly on his arm, as she, too, recognized the danger the man represented. "Steady," Nathaniel murmured quietly, covering her hand with his own. "We have prepared for this." Let him see exactly what he did not expect to find. Ilara took a slow breath, straightened her shoulders, and lifted her chin with the same quiet strength that had first caught Nathaniel's attention days ago in the doorway of Ashcombe's sitting room. "Then let us greet our guest," she said, "and show him precisely how mistaken his assumptions truly are." Together, they moved to welcome Charles Pemberton, both of them fully aware that the true test of everything they had rebuilt in the past week was only just beginning. Charles Pemberton's smile did not waver as he approached, though Nathaniel had known him long enough to recognize the flicker of surprise behind his eyes before it was carefully smoothed away. He bowed low, first to Nathaniel, then to Ilara, his gaze lingering just a fraction too long on the unmistakable curve of her stomach. "Your Grace," Charles said smoothly, "Duchess, I confess, the rumors reaching the city painted quite a different picture of your household. I am relieved to see they were exaggerated. Rumors often are, Nathaniel replied evenly, his tone pleasant, but his eyes carrying a warning that Charles would have been foolish to miss. I trust you will help correct the record, given how quickly such misunderstandings tend to spread. Of course, Charles said, inclining his head. Nothing would please me more than to see the Hale family united and thriving. The words were smooth, practiced, and entirely unconvincing to anyone who knew Charles well. Ilara, standing composed beside her husband, offered a polite smile of her own, though Nathaniel could feel the tension coiled tightly beneath her calm exterior. You must be looking forward to the arrival of your child, Charles continued, his tone light, almost too light. Though I confess, the timing does seem rather sudden. I had not heard any announcement of an expected heir until quite recently. The insinuation hung in the air, delicate but unmistakable. Nathaniel felt his jaw tighten, but he had prepared for exactly this kind of veiled attack, and he refused to let Charles see even a flicker of the anger building beneath his composed exterior. We chose to keep the news private during the early months, as many families do, Nathaniel said smoothly. Given the complications of Ilara's health in the first trimester, we thought it wise to avoid unnecessary attention until we were certain all was well. I am sure you understand the caution. It was a lie, carefully constructed in the days leading up to the gathering, designed specifically to close off exactly the kind of doubt Charles was now attempting to plant. Ilara had helped him craft it, understanding better than anyone the importance of leaving no gaps for suspicion to grow within. Charles's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course, a wise precaution indeed. He glanced once more at Ilara before adding, You must forgive my curiosity, Duchess. It is simply unusual, is it not, for a couple who had seemingly separated to reconcile so completely, and so quickly. Ilara met his gaze directly, her voice steady and clear enough for several nearby guests to hear. Marriages are rarely as simple as outside observers assume, Lord Pemberton. Nathaniel and I have faced our share of difficulties, as many couples do, but our commitment to one another, and to our child, has never truly wavered. I would think a family as devoted to tradition as yours would understand the importance of preserving a marriage rather than celebrating its downfall. The rebuke was gentle in tone but sharp in substance, and several guests within earshot exchanged approving glances at the Duchess's composed defense of her marriage. Charles, sensing the shifting mood around him, offered a stiff nod and a tight smile. Naturally, he said. I only wish you both continued happiness. With that, he excused himself, moving deeper into the crowd, though Nathaniel did not miss the calculating glance he cast backward, before disappearing among the other guests. That will not be the end of it, Ilara murmured quietly once Charles was out of earshot. No, Nathaniel agreed. It will not. But we handled it well. He arrived expecting to find weakness, and instead found unity. That alone should slow whatever plans he intended to set in motion. The gathering continued through the afternoon, filled with careful conversation, polite toasts, and the steady, deliberate work of re-establishing the Hale family's public image as strong and unified. Nathaniel remained close to Ilara throughout, offering his arm whenever she tired, ensuring she was never left standing too long, and making certain that every guest who spoke with them left with no doubt whatsoever about the sincerity of their reconciliation. By evening, as the last carriages departed and the grand hall slowly emptied, Ilara sank gratefully into a chair near the fireplace, exhaustion finally overtaking the composed strength she had maintained throughout the day. You did wonderfully, Nathaniel said, kneeling beside her chair and taking her hand gently in his. I am simply glad it is over, Ilara admitted, though a small, satisfied smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. Did you see his face when I mentioned tradition? I do believe I struck a nerve. Nathaniel laughed, a genuine warm sound that surprised them both with how natural it felt. You struck several nerves, I imagine. Charles has never handled public correction well. Their laughter faded into a comfortable silence, and for a long moment, they simply remained there together, the fire crackling softly, the events of the day settling around them like a shared victory neither had expected to achieve so completely. Nathaniel, Ilara said quietly after a while, her expression growing more serious. Do you truly believe this will be enough to stop him? Charles does not strike me as a man who gives up easily. Nathaniel's expression sobered as well. No, he is not. Today was merely the first move. He will regroup, and he will look for another angle, another weakness to exploit. We must remain vigilant. What sort of angle might he look for? Elara asked. Nathaniel considered this carefully before answering. Charles has always understood that direct confrontation rarely succeeds against our family. He prefers quieter methods. Whispered doubts planted in the right ears. Questions raised just subtly enough to seem like innocent curiosity, rather than deliberate attack. He may attempt to question the timing of our marriage itself, or seek out old records, or even approach household staff for information he can twist to his advantage. Elara's expression grew troubled. Margaret and the others have been nothing but loyal to me these past months. I do not doubt their loyalty, Nathaniel said gently. But loyalty can sometimes be tested by those skilled enough at manipulation. We must simply remain careful and united in everything we do going forward. Elara nodded slowly, absorbing this. Then, after a moment, she asked the question that had clearly been weighing on her mind since Charles's departure. Why does he want this so badly, Nathaniel? What does he truly stand to gain from our downfall? Nathaniel sighed, running a hand through his hair, as old, tired frustrations resurfaced. Charles has spent most of his adult life believing he was cheated of a position he felt entitled to within our family. His branch of the Hale lineage was set aside generations ago in favor of my grandfather's line, due to a dispute over inheritance that predates either of us. He has never accepted that decision as final. Should our marriage collapse, and should any doubt be cast on the legitimacy of our child, he would find himself remarkably well positioned to argue for a return of influence, if not outright inheritance claims, on behalf of his own branch of the family. That seems like an enormous scheme to build around gossip and rumor, Elara said. Charles has never needed much to work with, Nathaniel said grimly. He is patient, and he is thorough. We would be foolish to underestimate him, simply because today did not go as he hoped. Elara fell silent, processing this new understanding of the threat they faced. After a long moment, she looked up at Nathaniel, determination replacing the earlier exhaustion in her eyes. Then we will simply have to be more patient, and more thorough, than he is, she said firmly. Nathaniel smiled, a small, proud expression that softened the sharp lines of his face. I believe we will. That night, after the household had finally settled into quiet, Nathaniel found himself once again standing at his window, though this time his thoughts were not consumed by regret over the past, but by careful strategy for the future. He thought through every possible angle Charles might pursue, every vulnerability that might need shoring up, every precaution that might need taking in the weeks remaining before the child's arrival. He was so absorbed in his thoughts that he did not immediately notice Elara standing in the doorway of his study, watching him quietly. You should be resting, he said, finally noticing her presence. I could say the same to you, Elara replied, stepping into the room and settling carefully into the chair across from his desk. You have been standing there for nearly an hour. I am simply trying to anticipate what comes next, Nathaniel admitted. As am I, Elara said, which is why I came to speak with you. I believe we should consider reaching out to your solicitor about reviewing the original marriage contract, along with any records related to your family's inheritance disputes. If Charles intends to question the legitimacy of our situation, we should understand exactly what documentation exists, and ensure nothing within it can be twisted against us. Nathaniel regarded her with genuine admiration. That is an excellent suggestion. I have had a great deal of time these past months to consider how best to protect myself, and now our child, from exactly this kind of scheming, Elara said, a hint of weariness coloring her otherwise steady tone. It seems that preparation may finally prove useful. I am sorry you were forced to prepare for such things alone, Nathaniel said quietly. You are here now, Elara replied simply. That is what matters. They spent the remainder of the evening reviewing what documentation Nathaniel could recall from memory, drafting a list of records to request from his solicitor, and carefully mapping out every possible weakness Charles might attempt to exploit. By the time they finally retired for the night, a fragile but genuine partnership had formed between them, built not on the old formal politeness of their early marriage, but on shared purpose and mutual respect. Neither of them could have known, as they finally allowed themselves rest that evening, that Charles Pemberton was already sending discreet letters of his own, reaching out to contacts within the city who owed him favors, setting in motion a plan far more calculated than either Nathaniel or Alara had yet anticipated. The weeks following the gathering settled into a fragile rhythm at Ashcombe Estate, one built on careful vigilance rather than true peace. Nathaniel divided his time between managing correspondence from his solicitor and remaining close to Alara, whose condition grew more delicate as her final month approached. Dr. Bennett visited more frequently now, his expression carrying a quiet seriousness that suggested the arrival, while still expected to proceed smoothly, would require careful attention in its final stages. It was during one such visit, on a gray morning heavy with the promise of rain, that the first real sign of Charles Pemberton's continued scheming arrived at Ashcombe's doorstep, not in the form of a letter this time, but in the form of a visitor no one had expected. Margaret announced the arrival with obvious unease. "There is a woman at the gate, Your Grace. She claims to have information regarding matters that concern the household." She gave the name Beatrice Lowry. Nathaniel did not recognize the name, but something in Margaret's careful phrasing told him this was not an ordinary visit. He instructed her to bring the woman to his study, choosing deliberately to keep the meeting separate from Alara, at least until he understood what was happening. Beatrice Lowry proved to be a thin, sharp-eyed woman, of perhaps 40 years, dressed in clothing that suggested modest means carefully maintained. She curtsied stiffly upon entering the study, her eyes darting around the room with the nervous energy of someone unused to grand surroundings. "Your Grace," she said, "I apologize for the intrusion, but I felt it necessary to bring certain matters to your attention directly, rather than allow them to reach you through less reliable channels." "What matters would those be, Miss Lowry?" Nathaniel asked, keeping his tone carefully neutral, despite the wariness building in his chest. "I was approached recently by a gentleman representing certain interests within your extended family," Beatrice said carefully. "He offered me a considerable sum to provide testimony, suggesting irregularities within your household staff records, specifically regarding the timeline of the Duchess's residence here at Ashcombe, following your separation." Nathaniel's expression hardened. "Go on." "I previously worked as a seamstress in the city, and I was told that my testimony, suggesting I had fitted the Duchess for garments suggesting an advanced condition earlier than currently claimed, would be well compensated," Beatrice continued. "I was to claim I had visited Ashcombe several months prior to when the Duchess says her condition began, which would suggest a very different timeline than the one you have presented publicly." A cold, precise anger settled over Nathaniel, far more controlled than the hot fury he might have once displayed in similar circumstances. This was exactly the kind of quiet manipulation he had warned Alara about, exactly the sort of manufactured doubt Charles specialized in creating. "And why?" Nathaniel asked carefully. "Have you chosen to come to me instead of accepting this offer?" Beatrice hesitated, twisting her hands together nervously. "I have worked honestly my whole life, Your Grace. I do not wish to build my future on a lie that could destroy an innocent family, particularly not a lie involving a child who has done nothing to deserve such scheming. The gentleman who approached me offered generous payment, but he also made clear that refusal might carry consequences for my continued work within the city. I find myself trapped between two difficult choices, and I decided that honesty, however dangerous, was the only path I could live with." "Who approached you?" Nathaniel asked, though he already suspected the answer. "He did not give his full name," Beatrice said, "but he wore a signet ring bearing a crest I recognized as belonging to a branch of your family. Dark green stone, with a hawk carved into silver." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Charles's family crest, worn proudly on a ring he rarely removed. There was no longer any doubt. "You have done the right thing in coming to me," Nathaniel said carefully, "and you need not fear consequences from my family for your honesty. I intend to ensure you are protected, both from whatever threats have been made against you, and from any financial hardship that might result from refusing this scheme." Relief flooded across Beatrice's face, quickly followed by cautious hope. "Thank you, Your Grace. I feared I might be dismissed as a liar myself, given the sum of money involved." "I believe you," Nathaniel said firmly, "and your testimony, given honestly this time, may prove invaluable in exposing exactly the kind of manipulation my family has apparently been subjected to." After arranging for Beatrice to remain temporarily under the estate's protection, along with a promise of continued work within the household should she wish it, Nathaniel finally sought out Alara, finding her resting in the sitting room, with a book open but unread in her lap. He explained everything carefully, watching her expression shift from confusion to alarm to a controlled, simmering anger that mirrored his own. "He is willing to fabricate lies about my own body," Alara said, her voice tight with barely restrained fury. "About my own child's timeline. Has he no limits whatsoever?" "Apparently not," Nathaniel said grimly. "But this mistake may prove costly for him. We now have direct evidence of his scheming, along with a witness willing to testify honestly about his attempted manipulation." "What do we do with this information?" Alara asked. Nathaniel considered carefully before answering. "We could confront him directly, but I suspect that would simply drive his efforts further underground, making them harder to trace. I believe our better course is to gather additional evidence, quietly, while continuing to present a united front publicly. When we finally do act, we should ensure the evidence is overwhelming enough to end his scheming entirely, rather than simply delaying it." Alara nodded slowly, though frustration remained evident in the tight set of her shoulders.
"I hate feeling as though we must wait, Nathaniel."
"Every day he continues these schemes is another day of stress I could do without, particularly now." "I know," Nathaniel said, moving to sit beside her and taking her hand gently. "And I promise you, we will act as quickly as caution allows. I will not let him threaten our family any longer than absolutely necessary." Over the following days, Nathaniel worked carefully alongside his solicitor, gathering additional testimony from Beatrice, along with records confirming the timeline of Alara's residence at Ashcombe, and documentation from Dr. Bennett confirming the true progression of her pregnancy. Slowly, methodically, they built an undeniable case that would leave no room for Charles's manufactured doubts to take hold. Meanwhile, Alara's condition continued progressing toward its final weeks, and despite the underlying tension of their ongoing preparations against Charles, something genuinely warm continued growing between her and Nathaniel. Their evenings, once filled with strategic planning alone, gradually incorporated quieter moments as well, gentle conversations about names they might consider for the child, soft laughter over shared memories that had nothing to do with the threats surrounding them. One evening, as they sat together near the fireplace, Alara suddenly winced, her hand flying to her stomach. "Alara?" Nathaniel asked immediately, alarm flooding through him. "I am fine," she said, though her breathing remained slightly labored. "Just a strong movement." "The child seems particularly active this evening." Nathaniel reached out cautiously, and Alara guided his hand to the spot where the movement had occurred. A moment later, he felt it again, a firm, insistent pressure against his palm, and despite the lingering tension of recent weeks, he found himself smiling. "They seem eager to arrive," he said softly. "Dr. Bennett says perhaps another 3 weeks," Alara replied, covering his hand with her own, though he cautions that these things rarely follow an exact schedule. "Then we shall simply need to ensure everything is settled well before then," Nathaniel said, his tone carrying quiet determination. Alara looked up at him, her expression softening in a way that made his chest tighten with an emotion he was only just beginning to fully understand. "Nathaniel," she said quietly, "I find myself, despite everything, beginning to believe in the possibility of what we are building together. I did not expect that, given how we began." "Nor did I," Nathaniel admitted, "but I find myself grateful for it, regardless of how unexpected it has been." They remained together by the fire long into the evening, neither willing to break the fragile, hopeful peace settling between them, both aware that the coming weeks would test everything they had rebuilt, but neither willing to let that uncertainty steal the quiet happiness of the present moment. Unbeknownst to either of them, in the city, Charles Pemberton had grown increasingly frustrated by Beatrice Lowry's failure to deliver the testimony he had promised her payment for, and his patience, never particularly deep to begin with, had begun wearing dangerously thin. Charles Pemberton sat alone in his study late one evening, a glass of brandy untouched at his elbow, staring at a letter that confirmed his worst suspicion. Beatrice Lowry had disappeared entirely, along with any hope of the testimony he had so carefully arranged. Worse still, discreet inquiries among his contacts within the city suggested she had taken refuge somewhere connected to the Hale family, which could only mean one thing. Nathaniel knew. Charles crumpled the letter in his fist, frustration boiling beneath his carefully maintained composure. Years of patient positioning, careful cultivation of contacts and favors, all of it threatened to unravel because of one woman's sudden attack of conscience. He could not allow this setback to end his efforts entirely, Too much had been invested. Too much potential advantage remained just within reach. He needed a different approach, one less dependent on manufactured testimony that could be traced back to him and exposed as fabrication. It was his personal solicitor, a quiet, calculating man named Edmund Foss, who suggested the alternative path a few days later, during a private meeting in Charles's study. If direct fabrication carries too much risk, Lord Pemberton, perhaps a different strategy would serve better, Edmund suggested carefully. Rather than questioning the timeline of the pregnancy itself, we might instead question the original circumstances of the marriage. I have reviewed the original contract between the Hale and Winters families, and I believe I have identified a potential irregularity. Charles leaned forward with interest. What sort of irregularity? The marriage was arranged to settle a debt owed by the Winters family to the Hale estate, Edmund explained. However, the specific terms of that debt settlement were never fully documented in the official marriage contract itself, only referenced in a separate private agreement between the two family patriarchs. If we could obtain evidence suggesting that agreement was never properly witnessed or formalized according to legal requirements, we might be able to argue the marriage itself carries certain irregularities that could complicate matters of inheritance for any children born from it. Charles considered this carefully, a slow, satisfied smile spreading across his face. That is a far more elegant approach than relying on paid testimony. Legal irregularities are far harder to dismiss as simple gossip. Indeed, Edmund agreed. Though I must caution you, Lord Pemberton, pursuing this angle publicly carries its own risks. Should the Hale family successfully counter the challenge, and should your involvement become known, you would face significant damage to your own standing, potentially far worse than your current position. I am aware of the risks, Charles said, but I have waited too long and invested too much to simply abandon this opportunity now. Proceed with gathering the necessary documentation, quietly. I want to understand exactly how strong our position might be before we move forward with any formal challenge. Over the following 2 weeks, Edmund worked diligently, reviewing old records, consulting with legal contacts, and slowly building what Charles hoped would become an undeniable case, questioning the validity of Nathaniel and Alara's original marriage contract. Meanwhile, at Ashcombe, preparations for the child's imminent arrival continued alongside Nathaniel's own careful efforts to solidify their defenses against whatever Charles might attempt next. He had not heard anything further regarding Beatrice Lowry's original scheme, and while relief tempered his continued vigilance, a nagging sense of unease remained, warning him that Charles was unlikely to abandon his ambitions so easily. That unease proved well-founded when, on a cold morning nearly 3 weeks after Beatrice's revelations, Nathaniel received an unexpected visit from his own solicitor, a serious, dependable man named Arthur Whitfield, who arrived at Ashcombe with an expression of genuine concern. "Your Grace," Arthur said, once they were settled privately in Nathaniel's study, "I have received troubling word from contacts within the city courts. It appears Lord Pemberton has been quietly inquiring about the legal procedures required to challenge the validity of a marriage contract, specifically regarding cases where debt settlement agreements were involved in arranging the union." Nathaniel's stomach tightened with cold apprehension. He intends to challenge the legitimacy of my marriage itself, rather than simply the timeline of the child's conception. That appears to be his new strategy, yes, Arthur confirmed grimly. I have reviewed the original documentation between your father and the Winters family myself, Your Grace, and I must inform you that there is, unfortunately, some legitimate basis for concern. The private debt settlement agreement between the families was indeed never formally witnessed according to strict legal requirements, though such informal arrangements were common practice at the time your marriage was arranged. Common practice or not, could this genuinely threaten the legitimacy of my marriage? Nathaniel asked, his voice tight with barely controlled alarm. It is unlikely to succeed in truly dissolving the marriage after so many years, particularly given your continued cohabitation and the impending arrival of a child, Arthur said carefully. However, Lord Pemberton does not necessarily need to succeed in dissolving the marriage entirely. Simply raising sufficient public doubt about its legitimacy could create complications regarding inheritance rights, potentially opening the door for legal challenges regarding your child's claim to the Hale title and estate, particularly if Lord Pemberton can successfully argue that irregularities in the marriage contract create ambiguity in succession matters. Nathaniel absorbed this grim assessment in silence, his mind racing through the implications. Charles had found a genuinely dangerous angle, one built not on fabricated testimony that could be easily dismissed, but on a real, if minor, legal irregularity that could be twisted into something far more threatening. "What can we do to counter this?" Nathaniel finally asked. Arthur considered carefully before responding. "The strongest remedy would be to formalize your marriage anew, through a fresh, undeniably proper legal ceremony and documentation, removing any ambiguity regarding its validity. This would not erase the original marriage, but it would provide an unquestionable legal foundation moving forward, one that Lord Pemberton would find far more difficult to challenge." "A second wedding," Nathaniel said slowly, considering the idea. "Essentially, yes," Arthur confirmed. "Though I would recommend framing it not as a correction of any deficiency, but rather as a celebration of your reconciliation, timed appropriately before the child's arrival, to remove any doubt whatsoever regarding the legitimacy of their birth within a properly recognized marriage." Nathaniel nodded slowly, already turning the idea over in his mind. It was not simply a legal strategy, he realized. It could also serve as something genuinely meaningful, an opportunity to properly commit himself to Alara in a way their original arranged marriage never truly allowed, a choice made freely, rather than out of family obligation. He found Alara resting in the nursery, which had been slowly taking shape over the past weeks, with the careful additions of a small crib, soft blankets, and gentle furnishings, prepared with obvious love and attention. She looked up as he entered, immediately reading the seriousness in his expression. "What has happened?" she asked. Nathaniel explained everything carefully, watching worry and frustration flicker across her face as she absorbed the news of Charles's latest scheme. When he finished, however, and explained Arthur's suggested remedy, her expression shifted into something more thoughtful. "A new wedding," she repeated slowly. "Given properly, and freely chosen this time, rather than arranged to settle a debt between families." "Yes," Nathaniel said. "I understand if the idea feels strange, given everything that has passed between us. But beyond simply protecting our child's legitimacy, I find that I genuinely wish for the opportunity to commit myself to you properly, in a way our original marriage never allowed either of us to choose freely." Alara studied him carefully, her hand resting gently over her rounded stomach. "You are certain this is not simply another strategic necessity, forced upon us by Charles's scheming?" "It began as a legal strategy, yes," Nathaniel admitted honestly. "But the more I consider it, the more I find that I genuinely want this, Alara. Not because our current marriage requires legal reinforcement, but because I want the chance to choose you properly, publicly, and completely, in a way I failed to do the first time." Something in Alara's expression softened at his honesty, the careful guardedness she had maintained since his arrival at Ashcombe, finally beginning to fully dissolve. "Then perhaps," she said quietly, "we should give Charles Pemberton exactly the opposite of what he hopes to find. Instead of doubt and scandal, let us give him an unmistakable celebration of commitment that leaves absolutely no room for his schemes to take hold." "Then you agree?" Nathaniel asked, hope evident in his voice. "I agree," Alara said, a genuine smile finally breaking across her face. "Though I insist we plan it quickly, Nathaniel. I do not intend to attend my own wedding while too heavily pregnant to properly enjoy it, nor do I wish to delay matters so long that our child arrives before we have properly settled this threat." Nathaniel laughed, relief and genuine happiness mixing together in a way that felt entirely unfamiliar and entirely welcome. "Then we shall move quickly indeed." Plans were set into motion immediately, a proper ceremony arranged for just 10 days later, small and intimate compared to the grand gathering held weeks before, but formal and undeniably legitimate in every legal sense required to close off Charles's scheming entirely. Arthur worked tirelessly alongside additional solicitors to ensure every document was prepared with impeccable, unquestionable precision, leaving absolutely no ambiguity for future challenges. As the day of the ceremony approached, word inevitably reached Charles Pemberton, and Nathaniel received confirmation, through careful inquiries of his own, that the news had landed exactly as intended. Charles's scheme, built so carefully around exploiting legal ambiguity, would find itself entirely undone by a marriage so thoroughly and publicly reformalized that no court in the land would find grounds to question its validity. Still, Nathaniel remained cautious, aware that a man as determined as Charles rarely accepted defeat gracefully, and that the true confrontation, when it finally came, might prove far more direct and far more dangerous than the quiet scheming that had characterized his efforts thus far. The morning of the ceremony arrived bright and clear, a welcome change from the gray, heavy skies that had lingered over Ashcombe for much of the preceding weeks. The small estate chapel had been carefully prepared, filled with simple but elegant arrangements of late autumn flowers, and a modest gathering of close family and trusted friends had assembled to witness what had been carefully framed to the wider public as a joyful reaffirmation of the Hale marriage. Nathaniel stood at the front of the chapel, dressed in formal attire, his heart pounding with a nervous anticipation, entirely different from the cold obligation he had felt on the day of his original wedding years before. This time, he understood exactly what he was choosing, and exactly why it mattered so deeply. When Alara appeared at the chapel entrance, dressed in a simple, elegant gown carefully tailored to accommodate her advanced pregnancy, Nathaniel found himself entirely unable to look away. She walked slowly, her hand resting on Margaret's arm for support, her expression calm, but her eyes bright with an emotion that mirrored his own. The ceremony itself was brief but heartfelt, the presiding clergyman speaking simple, genuine words about commitment freely chosen, rather than obligation, reluctantly accepted. When the time came for them to exchange their vows, Nathaniel found the words coming easily, without the careful rehearsal he had expected to need. "I did not choose you freely the first time," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the small chapel. "But I choose you now, Alara, fully and completely, not out of obligation or strategy, but because I have come to understand exactly what I nearly lost, and exactly what I wish to build with you moving forward. I spent a long time believing our marriage would never be more than an arrangement neither of us truly chose," she said softly. "But you have shown me, these past weeks, that people can change, that commitment can be rebuilt, even after it has been neglected. I choose you too, Nathaniel, freely, and with hope for everything still ahead of us." As they exchanged rings, formalizing their renewed commitment before witnesses and law alike, Nathaniel felt a genuine peace settle over him, different from the anxious determination that had driven him through the preceding weeks. Whatever schemes Charles Pemberton might still attempt, this moment, this choice, belonged entirely to him and Alara, untouchable by outside manipulation. The small celebration that followed carried a warmth entirely absent from the grand, tense gathering weeks before. Family members who had witnessed the earlier strain between them now openly remarked on the genuine happiness evident in both Nathaniel and Alara's expressions, and even the most skeptical relatives found themselves gradually won over by the obvious sincerity of their reconciliation. It was during this celebration, as guests mingled and enjoyed the modest feast prepared for the occasion, that Arthur approached Nathaniel quietly, drawing him aside with an expression suggesting important news. "Your Grace, I have received word from my contacts regarding Lord Pemberton's reaction to today's ceremony," Arthur said in a low voice. "It appears he has abandoned his legal challenge entirely, recognizing that any attempt to question the marriage's validity now would only expose his own scheming, without any realistic hope of success." Relief flooded through Nathaniel, though a lingering wariness remained. "That is welcome news, but I doubt Charles will simply accept defeat gracefully." "Perhaps not," Arthur agreed. "But without a viable legal angle remaining, his options for causing further trouble have grown significantly limited. I would recommend continued caution, but I believe the most serious threat has now passed." Nathaniel nodded, allowing himself a genuine moment of relief before returning to the celebration, finding Alara seated comfortably near the fireplace, surrounded by well-wishing relatives, her hand resting contentedly over her stomach. "Good news?" she asked quietly as he settled beside her. "Charles appears to have abandoned his legal challenge," Nathaniel said softly, careful not to draw attention from the surrounding guests. "Arthur believes the most serious threat has passed." Alara's shoulders relaxed visibly, a genuine smile spreading across her face. "Then perhaps we might finally focus entirely on preparing for our child's arrival, without the constant shadow of Charles's scheming hanging over us." "I would like nothing more," Nathaniel agreed, reaching out to take her hand gently. The following days brought a welcome sense of calm to Ashcombe, the frantic pace of legal maneuvering and strategic planning finally giving way to simpler, quieter preparations. Nathaniel found himself genuinely enjoying the small domestic routines that had once felt foreign to him, helping arrange the nursery, discussing potential names with Alara late into the evening, and simply sitting beside her as she rested, content in a way he had never experienced before. One evening, as they reviewed a list of potential names together, Alara suddenly went very still, her hand flying to her stomach, a sharp intake of breath escaping her lips. "Alara?" Nathaniel asked immediately, alarm flooding through him. "I believe," Alara said carefully, breathing through what was clearly a strong contraction, "that our child may have decided the waiting is finally over." Nathaniel's heart leapt into his throat, equal parts excitement and terror flooding through him, as he immediately called for Margaret and sent urgent word for Dr. Bennett. The household, which had settled into calm domestic routine over the preceding days, suddenly burst into organized, purposeful activity, everyone moving with practiced efficiency toward the moment they had all been anticipating. As Alara was carefully settled into the room prepared for the birth, Nathaniel found himself pacing anxiously in the corridor outside, his earlier calm entirely replaced by nervous energy he could not quite contain. Margaret, passing by with fresh linens, paused briefly to offer a reassuring smile. "First births often take time, Your Grace," she said kindly. "Try not to wear yourself out with worry before the true moment arrives." Nathaniel nodded, though he found the reassurance did little to calm his racing thoughts. He had faced difficult negotiations, managed vast estates through periods of significant challenge, and even confronted the calculated schemes of a determined rival. But nothing had ever left him feeling quite as helpless as standing outside that door, unable to do anything but wait, while Alara faced the culmination of 9 long months entirely on her own within that room. Hours passed slowly, marked by occasional sounds from within the room that made Nathaniel's chest tighten with worry each time. Dr. Bennett arrived promptly and disappeared into the room as well, and the household settled into a tense, anticipatory quiet as the night wore on. It was nearing dawn when Nathaniel finally heard it, a sound that stopped him entirely in his pacing, a small, sharp cry that pierced through the closed door and settled directly into his chest. A moment later, the door opened, and Margaret appeared, exhaustion evident on her face but overshadowed entirely by genuine joy. "Your Grace," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "you have a daughter." Nathaniel felt his knees nearly buckle beneath the weight of that single sentence. A daughter. His daughter. He entered the room slowly, almost reverently, finding Alara propped against a nest of pillows, exhausted but radiant, cradling a small, impossibly tiny bundle against her chest. "Nathaniel," she said softly, looking up at him with an expression of pure, exhausted joy. "Come meet her." He approached slowly, kneeling beside the bed, and Alara carefully shifted the small bundle so he could see clearly the tiny face peering out from the soft blankets, eyes tightly closed, a small tuft of dark hair visible against her forehead. "She is perfect," Nathaniel whispered, his voice thick with emotion he made no effort to hide. "She is," Alara agreed softly. "Would you like to hold her?" Nathaniel's hands trembled slightly as Alara carefully transferred the small bundle into his arms. He had never held anything so small, so impossibly fragile, and yet the moment he settled his daughter against his chest, something inside him shifted permanently. A fierce, protective love, unlike anything he had ever experienced, settling firmly into place. "I promise you," he said quietly, looking down at his daughter's peaceful face, "that I will spend every remaining day of my life protecting you, and loving you, and making certain you never doubt for even a single moment how deeply you are wanted." Alara watched him with tears glistening in her eyes, exhaustion and joy mingling together in an expression that Nathaniel knew he would remember for the rest of his life. "We should decide on her name," Alara said softly after a long, peaceful silence. "I believe we already agreed," Nathaniel said, smiling down at his daughter. "Rosalind, was it not? For your grandmother." "Rosalind Hale," Alara said softly, testing the name aloud. "Yes, that suits her perfectly." As dawn broke fully over Ashcombe Estate, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and pink, Nathaniel sat beside Alara's bed, his daughter cradled gently in his arms, and allowed himself, finally, to fully believe in the possibility of the happiness he had once so carelessly nearly thrown away. News of Rosalind's birth spread quickly through both the estate and the wider family. carried by joyful letters and word of mouth that reached even the most distant relatives within days. Congratulations poured in from every direction, and Ashcombe, once quiet and subdued during Alara's long months of isolation, now buzzed with warm activity as visitors arrived to offer their well wishes and catch their first glimpse of the newest addition to the Hale family. Nathaniel found himself transformed in ways he could scarcely have predicted just weeks before. Where once he had approached each day with cold efficiency, focused entirely on estate matters and family obligation, he now found himself eagerly anticipating each moment spent with his small daughter, marveling at every tiny change, every small sound she made, every flicker of expression crossing her impossibly small features. Alara, recovering steadily under Dr. Bennett's careful supervision, watched this transformation with a mixture of quiet satisfaction and lingering caution. She had seen enough of Nathaniel's coldness during their early marriage to remain careful about fully trusting this new warmth, even as she allowed herself to hope it might truly last. It was nearly 2 weeks after Rosalind's birth, during a quiet afternoon, while Alara rested and Nathaniel sat nearby holding his daughter, that Margaret arrived with news that immediately shattered the peaceful atmosphere of the household. "Your Grace," she said, her expression grave. "Lord Pemberton has arrived, and he is requesting an audience. He says the matter is urgent and concerns the legitimacy of young Lady Rosalind's birth." Nathaniel's arms tightened protectively around his sleeping daughter, old anger flooding back with surprising intensity. He had believed, perhaps naively, that Charles's schemes had ended with the failure of his legal challenge weeks before. Apparently, he had been mistaken. "Bring him to the study," Nathaniel said, his voice cold and controlled. "I will speak with him alone." "Nathaniel," Alara said, stirring from her rest, concern evident in her voice. "What is happening?" "Charles has arrived," Nathaniel said grimly. "Apparently he is not yet finished with his scheming. Stay here and rest, my love. I will handle this." He carefully passed Rosalind into Alara's waiting arms and made his way to the study, anger simmering just beneath his carefully controlled exterior. He found Charles waiting there already, seated comfortably as though he owned the room, an expression of cool confidence arranged carefully across his features. "Charles," Nathaniel said, his voice carrying a warning edge as he closed the door behind him. "I understand you have concerns regarding my daughter's legitimacy. I confess, I find that rather surprising, given how thoroughly your previous attempts to manufacture doubt have already failed." Charles smiled, unbothered by the hostility in Nathaniel's tone. "I merely wish to ensure everything has been handled properly, cousin. After all, the timing of certain events has raised questions among various members of our extended family, questions I feel obligated to address directly, given my own position within the Hale lineage." "What questions precisely?" Nathaniel asked, his patience wearing thin. "It has come to my attention," Charles said smoothly, "that a certain woman, a seamstress by the name of Beatrice Lowry, has been residing under your protection here at Ashcombe for several weeks now. I understand she was prepared to offer testimony regarding certain irregularities in the timeline of your wife's pregnancy, testimony that mysteriously disappeared once she came under your influence." Nathaniel's expression remained carefully neutral, though internally he felt a flash of satisfaction. Charles had just openly admitted to knowledge of his own scheme, precisely the kind of admission Nathaniel had been waiting for. "You are correct that Miss Lowry has been residing here," Nathaniel said calmly, "though I believe you have the circumstances somewhat reversed. She came to me directly, Charles, to report that a man matching your description had attempted to bribe her into providing false testimony against my family, using threats against her livelihood to secure her cooperation." For the first time, a flicker of genuine alarm crossed Charles's carefully composed features. "That is a serious accusation, Nathaniel, and one I would caution you against making without substantial proof." "I have substantial proof," Nathaniel said, reaching into his desk drawer and producing a written statement, carefully signed and witnessed, detailing everything Beatrice had reported weeks before. "This statement, along with Miss Lowry's willingness to testify formally if necessary, provides more than sufficient evidence of your attempted manipulation." Charles's composure cracked visibly now, genuine alarm replacing his earlier confidence. "This changes nothing regarding the legal irregularities in your original marriage contract." "Ah, yes, the irregularities you attempted to exploit through your solicitor, Edmund Foss," Nathaniel said, watching with grim satisfaction, as Charles's face paled further. Did you truly believe I would not learn of that scheme as well? My own solicitor identified the very same vulnerability weeks ago, which is precisely why Alara and I chose to formalize our marriage anew, through a ceremony so thoroughly and properly documented that no court in the land would find grounds to question its validity. Your entire legal strategy collapsed the moment we exchanged vows before witnesses and proper legal counsel. Charles said nothing, his mind clearly racing to find some remaining angle of attack, some path forward that did not end in complete and total defeat. I could pursue formal charges against you, Charles, Nathaniel continued, his voice hardening further. Attempted bribery, manufactured testimony, deliberate efforts to undermine my marriage, and threaten my child's legitimate inheritance. Such charges would not simply damage your reputation, they would likely end any remaining influence you hold within polite society entirely. What is it you want, Nathaniel? Charles finally asked, his voice tight with barely controlled desperation. I want you to abandon this scheme entirely, and permanently, Nathaniel said firmly. I want your assurance, in writing, that you will make no further attempts to question my marriage or my daughter's legitimacy, and that you will cease all contact with anyone employed within my household unless conducted through entirely proper and transparent channels. In exchange, I am willing to keep this matter private, rather than pursuing the formal charges you so clearly deserve. Charles's jaw tightened, pride warring visibly with the practical recognition that he had no remaining leverage whatsoever. Finally, after a long, tense silence, he nodded stiffly. You have my word, he said, though the words came out clipped and resentful. I will make no further attempts regarding your marriage or your daughter. See that you keep that word, Nathaniel said coldly, because should I ever learn of further scheming on your part, I will not hesitate to pursue every legal consequence available to me, regardless of the damage it might cause to our family's reputation in the process. Charles rose stiffly, his earlier confidence entirely deflated, and made his way toward the door without another word. Just before leaving, however, he paused, turning back with an expression that mixed bitterness with something almost approaching genuine curiosity. Tell me, Nathaniel, he said quietly, was it truly worth it, all this effort to salvage a marriage you yourself tried to end just weeks ago? Nathaniel considered the question carefully before answering. I did not understand what I stood to lose, Charles, until I very nearly lost it. Now that I do understand, yes, every bit of effort has been entirely worth it. I would suggest you spend less time scheming against families who have wronged you in the past, and more time building something worth protecting in your own life. Charles offered no response, simply nodding once before departing, leaving Nathaniel alone in his study with a profound sense of relief finally settling over him. The threat that had shadowed his family for weeks had finally, truly, come to an end. He found Alara still resting with Rosalind in the sitting room, worry evident on her face as she waited for news of his conversation with Charles. It is finished, Nathaniel said, settling beside her and gently taking Rosalind into his arms, as Alara watched with cautious relief. Charles has agreed to abandon his schemes entirely, and I have ensured he understands the consequences should he ever attempt anything further. Truly finished? Alara asked, hardly daring to believe it. Truly finished, Nathaniel confirmed. We are free now, Alara, to simply focus on building our life together, without the constant shadow of his scheming hanging over us. Alara's shoulders finally relaxed completely, months of accumulated tension visibly releasing as she leaned against Nathaniel, watching him hold their daughter with a tenderness that had become entirely natural to him over these past weeks. I never imagined, she said softly, that the man who arrived here weeks ago, intending to end our marriage, would become the man now fighting so fiercely to protect it. Nor did I, Nathaniel admitted, but I am deeply grateful for whatever circumstance brought me to that realization, however painful the path leading there might have been. They sat together in comfortable silence for a long while, watching Rosalind sleep peacefully in Nathaniel's arms, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, the estate around them finally settling into genuine, well-earned peace, after weeks of careful strategy and quiet tension. What comes next for us? Alara asked eventually, her voice carrying genuine curiosity, rather than the wariness that had once colored so many of her questions to him. Whatever we choose to build together, Nathaniel said simply. I no longer intend to treat this marriage as an obligation, Alara. I intend to treat it as a genuine partnership, one built on honesty, respect, and the kind of love I very nearly failed to recognize before it was almost too late. Alara smiled, reaching up to gently touch his face, a gesture of genuine affection that would have seemed impossible between them just weeks before. Then let us build that life together, Nathaniel, properly and completely, exactly as we now both choose. As evening settled fully over Ashcombe Estate, casting long, peaceful shadows across the garden where their story had truly begun weeks before, Nathaniel and Alara Hale finally allowed themselves to simply exist together, free from scheming rivals and old grievances, as a genuine family built not on obligation, but on hard-won, deeply valued love. Spring arrived at Ashcombe Estate with a warmth that seemed to mirror the changes within its walls. Rosalind, now nearly 5 months old, had grown into a bright, curious infant, with her mother's steady gaze and her father's stubborn determination, evident even in the way she refused to settle, until she had inspected every corner of whichever room she occupied. Nathaniel had taken to spending his mornings walking the grounds with Alara and Rosalind, a routine that had become so natural to him that he could hardly remember the man who had once considered such simple pleasures a waste of valuable time. The estate itself had transformed alongside its residents, the once quiet, subdued atmosphere replaced by genuine warmth and activity, household staff moving through their duties with visible contentment, rather than the careful, cautious energy that had characterized the early days of Alara's isolation. It was during one such morning walk that Alara raised a subject she had been considering carefully for several weeks. "I received a letter yesterday from my mother," she said, her tone carefully neutral in a way that immediately caught Nathaniel's attention. He knew little of Alara's family beyond the basic details of the debt settlement that had originally arranged their marriage, and he was aware that her relationship with her parents had grown distant in the years since, particularly during the difficult months of her pregnancy when they had offered little support or comfort. "What did she have to say?" Nathaniel asked carefully. "She has heard, of course, of Rosalind's birth, and of our renewed marriage," Alara said. "She writes requesting permission to visit, to meet her granddaughter properly for the first time. How do you feel about that request?" Nathaniel asked, genuinely curious rather than dismissive, a shift in his approach that Alara had come to deeply appreciate over recent months. "Conflicted," Alara admitted honestly. "My parents were not unkind to me, precisely, but they made their priorities quite clear when they arranged this marriage. My comfort and happiness were never truly considered, only the settlement of their debt and the securing of their family's continued standing. I do not know if I am ready to simply welcome them back into my life, as though none of that ever happened." Nathaniel considered this carefully, understanding all too well the complicated weight of family obligation and old grievances, having faced his own difficult reckoning with such matters through his conflict with Charles. "You are not obligated to forgive anyone before you are genuinely ready," he said gently. "But perhaps allowing a visit does not require full forgiveness. Perhaps it simply requires openness to seeing whether your relationship with them might grow into something healthier, given time and honest conversation." Alara considered this thoughtfully. "You have grown remarkably wise on matters of family reconciliation, Nathaniel, given how recently you yourself required such wisdom applied to your own circumstances." Nathaniel laughed, genuine warmth in the sound. "I have had excellent teachers these past months, chief among them my own wife, who showed remarkable patience with a man who very nearly did not deserve it." They decided together to invite Alara's parents for a brief visit the following month, carefully framed as an opportunity to meet Rosalind rather than a grand reconciliation, allowing space for honest conversation, without the pressure of immediately resolving years of accumulated distance. The visit, when it finally arrived, proved far less tense than either Nathaniel or Alara had anticipated. Alara's mother, a soft-spoken woman named Constance, arrived with genuine tears in her eyes at the sight of her granddaughter, and her father, a reserved man named Edwin Winters, though initially formal and awkward, gradually warmed as the day progressed, watching his daughter interact easily and happily with her husband, in a way he had clearly not expected to witness. "I confess," Edwin said quietly to Nathaniel during a private moment in the garden, "I did not believe this marriage would ever grow into anything genuine. I arranged it purely out of necessity, and I have carried guilt over that decision for years, watching Alara's letters grow increasingly distant and unhappy." "I understand that guilt well," Nathaniel admitted. "I very nearly threw away everything worth having, through my own carelessness and cold indifference. It took nearly losing Alara entirely to understand what I had been neglecting. And now? Edwin asked. Now I intend to spend the rest of my life ensuring she never again doubts how deeply she is valued, Nathaniel said firmly. Both her and our daughter. Edwin nodded slowly, something like genuine respect settling into his expression. Then perhaps this arranged marriage, whatever its flawed beginnings, has found its way towards something genuinely worthwhile after all. By the time Alara's parents departed several days later, a fragile but genuine foundation for renewed family connection had been established, built not on the old obligations that had originally bound their families together, but on honest conversation and the slow, careful rebuilding of trust. As summer approached, life at Ashcombe settled into a genuine, contented rhythm. Nathaniel divided his attention carefully between his duties managing the estate and the family lands, and the simple, treasured moments spent with Alara and Rosalind, moments he had once believed himself too busy or too important to properly value. Word occasionally reached them of Charles Pemberton, who had retreated largely from public society following his failed scheming. His reputation quietly diminished among those who had heard whispers of his attempted manipulation, though the full details had remained carefully private, exactly as Nathaniel had promised. Nathaniel felt no particular satisfaction in Charles's diminished standing, only relief that the threat had finally, genuinely passed, allowing his family to build their future without the constant shadow of old family rivalries hanging over them. One warm evening, as the sun set slowly over the fields surrounding Ashcombe, Nathaniel found Alara sitting in the garden, Rosalind resting contentedly in her arms, watching the golden light settle over the roses that had first bloomed the day he arrived, papers in hand, intending to end everything they had since built together. He settled beside her quietly, watching his daughter's peaceful face, listening to the soft evening sounds of the estate around them. "Do you ever think of that day?" Alara asked quietly, following his gaze toward the garden entrance where he had first seen her standing, revealing the truth that had changed everything between them. "Often," Nathaniel admitted. "I think of how close I came to losing everything that truly matters, simply because I failed to recognize its value until circumstances forced me to confront it directly." "And what do you feel when you think of it now?" Alara asked. Nathaniel considered the question carefully, watching the last light of evening fade slowly into soft twilight around them. "Gratitude," he finally said. "Gratitude that circumstances forced my hand before it was truly too late, and gratitude that you were willing to give me the chance to prove myself worthy of what we have built since." Alara leaned against him gently, Rosalind stirring slightly in her arms before settling back into peaceful sleep. "I am grateful as well," she said softly, "for second chances, properly earned rather than simply given." They remained there together, as full darkness settled over Ashcombe, the estate quiet and peaceful around them, no longer haunted by old grievances or looming threats. Simply home, in every sense that truly mattered. Whatever challenges the future might still bring, Nathaniel understood now, with complete and unwavering certainty, exactly what he stood to protect, and exactly how deeply he had come to value the family he had so very nearly let slip entirely from his grasp. The story of the Duke who arrived intending to end his marriage, only to discover instead the family he had never truly allowed himself to build, would be remembered within Ashcombe for generations to come, not as a tale of scandal or scheming, but as a quiet testament to the possibility of genuine change, however late it might arrive, and however unexpected the circumstances that finally demanded it.